and welcome to Women's Talk Fem Fridays. I am so excited today that I get to have a really special guest on with me, the author of Emotional Labour, Rose Hackman. Hello, Rose, how are you?
Hi, I'm so well. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh no, thank you for being here. For anyone who doesn't know, Emotional Labour is a new book that Rose has written. It is available now. I've flown through it. I haven't finished it yet. I'm on chapter 8. And I just think it is so interesting, and there are so many topics that I want to pick through with you. And I know we won't have time to do it all today. But for anybody who is watching, please do go out and get that book, whether you get it on audiobook or for your Kindle or whatever. Please just get it. It is fantastic. So first of all, thanks so much for coming on, Rose. And I just want to start off by saying emotional labor. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah. So emotional labor is a form of work that we're not used to qualifying as work at all, but it definitely is work. So the formal definition is the editing work of feelings you will do on yourself in order to have an effect on the feelings of someone else. So it's a smile that you will provide to a group, regardless of whether you're feeling good inside, in order to make them feel good inside. So in our society, this is a form of work that is highly invisible. We don't see it. It's highly feminized. So we offload it onto women. We expect women to do it constantly, sometimes racialized depending on the race of the group. It's also very much devalued. We either don't pay for it or we pay very little for it. And yet, what I argue in the book is it's one of the most essential forms of work in our society, because it's the work that forges and reforges community. It's the work that forges and reforges families. It's how we're all functional right now, is because not just we're doing emotional labor, but a lot of people have done emotional labor for us to be functional human beings.
And sorry, shush. Come here, a minute.
Perfect appearance.
Yeah, absolutely. Every time. Come here. So emotional labor then, how does it present itself? How does somebody deliver emotional labor for someone else?
So I think I live in the US, and the best way of recognizing it immediately is in work context. So for example, a server who will come up to you at a restaurant and say, "Hi, my name is Brittany, I'll be your server today. How are you doing?" That's emotional labor. Brittany might not be in a good mood at all. She'll probably, in fact, have all sorts of things going on at home, but she's putting that to the side in order to make her restaurant guests feel good. And in the US, in order to secure tips. So it's also the work of nurses, nursing assistant. When we talk about bedside manner, that's 100% emotional labor. If you call up customer service representative to complain about an issue, you might be really annoyed. They're going to have to contain your feelings. That's emotional labor. So it's actually a form of work that is the central part of millions and millions of jobs. But because it is so feminized, and because we think of it just as like women being women and just what women are naturally good at, so it's not really work, we often, refuse to kind of see it in the same way than we see physical labor, intellectual labor, creative labor. Those we all see and value as real. And emotional labor, which is so prevalent in the services industries, in the really everywhere, in the customer, anything that's customer facing, patient facing, anything that's, yeah. So that's emotional labor. And then in private, it's in families, let's say, it's the job so often taken on by women, by mothers, by often even daughters, depending on the situation. Who's going to be in charge of everyone else's well-being? Who's going to take the high road for the interest of the group? That might seem very little when I say it just like that. It might seem like, oh, but whatever. But when a woman is taking charge of the well-being of the group, she's often doing it at great sacrifice to herself. Even from a time perspective, emotional labor is very time consuming. Preemptive thoughtfulness of thinking, what do they want to eat? What time do they need to get here? How is my husband going to react when I say this? How can I help him navigate that? someone should take care of my parents, who's going to pick up who when. That's logistics, and it's the mental load, but it's all efforts and things that you're basically doing explicitly because you're taking charge of other people's well-being around you. It's exhausting.
Yeah, that just sounds so familiar, not just from myself, but from most of my friends as well. I think you describe it in the book really well when you say it's like having loads and loads of little tabs open on a computer, and they're all running at the same time, and you've got to keep on top of them all. I very much feel like that just is exactly how it feels when it's in your head, and things just aren't in straight lines. It gets so difficult. Apologies if anyone can hear my dog. This is another difference between me and my husband both do podcasts. His podcasts are always really quiet because I keep the dogs away and the children. Unfortunately, I don't get the same luxuries, but that's, I guess, another highlight of what I'm trying to do here. Highlight, the differences between how women have to get through every day and how men have to get through every day. One of the things early on in the book you talk about is the idea of taking your husband's name, and how women, there's the expectation when you get married you take your husband's name. That's just the done thing. I've actually been criticized for taking my husband's name. My argument's always been, well, it's either my husband's or my dad's.
Right.
Either way, it's a man whose name I get, unless we create a new name, which if I was to do it again, I think maybe I would do that, Princess Consuela banana hammock and all of that. There is this problem, and it is a problem, of women sort of being seen as submissive to men in all ways. It's just so ingrained in our society. It is just inbuilt in what we do. How has that happened? I mean, how far back do we have to go to work out where it's come from?
I mean, there's a really good book actually by British journalist called Angela Saini that just came out called The Patriarchs, that goes into the origin of patriarchy. But one of the reasons I wanted to highlight that detail, that so many of us either expected or do take on our husbands' names, is just to point out how we think that because we have the right to vote, and because so many of us are working in, fields that previously maybe weren't accessible to us as women, because we have all of these new opportunities compared to, certainly my mother, definitely my grandmother, neither of them went to university. I got to go to university. So we kind of think that from a comparative perspective, we're doing so well. And yet all of these, as you say, ingrained, all of these other systems are still around us. So, I'm pointing out that we're taking on still overwhelmingly, not everyone, husbands' names, just to point out something that we barely pay attention to, but that actually points to the fact that generation after generation, we're at least nominally erasing women's contributions. But, I totally agree with you. I'm about to get married for the second time. And giving us another try 10 years after my first divorce.
Oh, congratulations. Second time's a charm, I'm sure.
Well, no, I feel, meeting someone in your 30s when you know who you are, certainly for me, has been a very different thing to in my early 20s, when I believed a lot of the romance that I had been fed in books and films. But I won't be taking on his name, but I'm already negotiating for children, what's the name going to be? And the point he makes is exactly what you make, is if we did end up putting my last name in there, let's say, it would just be my dad's name, that's all it would be. So it's we are caught in a bind, but I guess I think it's important for us though to pay attention to all of these invisible ways that we've just accepted a lot of the status quo, because it's only once we start understanding that we can start uprooting some of those things, but also start confronting what they mean, and maybe even redressing some of the injustices that we're just like so inured to, we're so used to them that we don't really point them out.
Yeah, and I think you in the book you talk about gender hierarchy, and I think these are all things that point to that. I think there will be, and there always is, there will be people who think, well, this is just how it's done. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. Feminists gone mad. But actually, I mean, how would you describe it? For me, it's very much like all of these little things that might seem little, when you put them all together, they create a landscape that is our society of gender hierarchy.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way in which we live is reproduced through all of these little instances where we protect men's experiences over our own. I mean, we're expected to protect everyone's experiences, to put ourselves to work for everyone else's experiences, but specifically we're put to work for men's experience. So men get to have the experience of seamlessness of having a podcast without a dog. And we, might be fine, without it, without that experience of seamlessness, but we're expected to cope to protect the experiences of predominantly men and society at large. So, I'm sorry. So remind me what your question was.
It was just really, obviously people are going to say that the mountain out of a molehill, but it does create a larger picture.
Right. It definitely does. It's such a trick to render invisible the way in which we're constantly expected to fall on our swords, even within our small families, right? Whether, we're daughters and it's with our brothers or at school. I remember from a really young age, this is so stupid, but I think it's so important. I played at school. There was a playground in my elementary and middle school. I went to school actually in Belgium. And the playground was taken up by a football pitch and a basketball court. And I was actually super sporty. So I really was always trying to play sport with the boys, but I was never they never let me play. So the girls would all be on the margins of this football field and basketball field while all the boys got to play sport during recess. And it's just, do that in 1,000 different ways. And you're really drumming home from a really young age a very specific experience of life, of who gets to enjoy life and who doesn't get to enjoy life. And, what I say to people who say this is all nonsense is, I mean, especially in America, once you start attaching dollar signs to something, they can't really deny it. So I will say, I mean, emotional labor is literally what huge parts of our economy run on, because of the service sector, because of the healthcare sector, because of all of these forms of work where the central part of the job is emotional labor. You can't deny it's real, and I laugh that sometimes people who refuse to see it as a real thing, once you stop doing it, then they'll suddenly start paying attention. And that works in professional settings. If, let's say, a nurse is like extremely rude, or let's say a server in a restaurant is like, my day is going shit, I hate you all and I wish I wasn't here, we would be like, what is going on? And that would be them refusing to do emotional labor. And at home, it's been interesting the last couple of months since I've been doing interviews, but also in-person events. I've had women share experiences of them basically in some home contexts stopping, like refusing to do it anymore. And like the kind of extreme reactions they get from their male partners. One in particular, her relationship actually ended. She felt like she was just being tasked with all of the domestic tasks in a way that didn't feel fair. And of course, emotional labor isn't all domestic tasks. But if you're doing domestic tasks specifically to create experience of ease and happiness for the people at home, that is part of emotional labor. So she said she started thinking, I'm his girlfriend. They're not even in a long-term relationship. They've just fallen into this rhythm where she's the one who cooks, where she's the one. So one Sunday, she told the room, this was at an event in Michigan, she literally just decided she wasn't going to cook for her boyfriend. So she just, she made herself her own food. Off she went. Her boyfriend went on hunger strike. This was such a weird way of lashing out. He was like,
God,
that she was not making him food, that he was like, I'm not going to eat. What are you going to do about that? I mean,
Watched you starve.
you know, and it's just so it's like people who say they don't think it's important or they don't think it's real, I think deep down they kind of know, and they're just kind of messing with us a bit, I think, because they're actually worried about a world in which we either stop doing it or we require them to do it too. And because you're in chapter 8, you've already read the chapter where I try and explain that actually a world in which men do more emotional labor is actually really beneficial for them too. It's not as if it's just requiring them to do more work. It would actually be very positive for their relationships and the longevity of their life.
Yeah, and I know that you've read Bell Hooks, and I know that she sort of says the patriarchy does sort of decimate what it is, what a man is before he even gets to his teenage years. You know, he has to like kill off parts of himself to get involved in the patriarchy. I suppose in a lot of respects, I'm really lucky where I am, because my husband, his emotional labor started when he was very young. He has had to be the calm, sensible one who took on everybody else's problems for most of his life. Wow. And so when he's here at home, he can cope with the children when they go absolutely bonkers, as you know, 6-year-olds do. And he stays really calm. And so his emotional labor is very much put into our children. I would say mine is certainly all the tabs open, knowing when everybody needs to do everything, making sure, and this was something that you said that really struck a chord with me, that I'm putting in the work with his family and my extended family to just check in and make sure everybody's all right and just keep those relationships going. And that's work. That's not something that I have to remind myself to do that. Obviously I love them, their family, but when you're busy, it's the guilt, and you go, right, I must remember to check in on these people today.
Right. Family community doesn't just happen. You have someone has to be working at it, or ideally multiple people have to be working at building that community unit, that family unit, for it to be a healthy, positive, good family unit, or, you know, broader community. So that's work, that's real work, and that's work that everyone within that family unit, you know, hugely benefits from. It's also necessary. You know, we need connection to one another, again, to survive, you know.
I want to, and I'm sorry, I'm sort of going through all the part that really stood out for me in the book so far. I really want to spend longer on every single part of it, so I might have to get you back on the show. But I wanted to pick on something that I think was in the last chapter, where you talked about the mammy trope. And I immediately knew what you meant. Before you'd explained it, I knew who Mammy was. So me and my sister were named after characters in a film called The Imitation of Life, Laura Lee and Sarah Jane, and they were brought up by a mammy. And I think they actually call her Mammy or Mama. And I was just like, oh, but that's true. But that's Hollywood have made that, and they've completely disregarded who this person is as a human when she takes off her hip and then goes home, most likely to do the same stuff at home that's unpaid.
Right.
And I found that really interesting, that there is a trope and it is so accepted. Everything we've talked about today seems to be like, yeah, that's the done thing, that's just how it is. So it does sort of intersect with, you know, racism as well. Have you found that? I know that I don't want to spoil the book for people and like giving away all your secrets, but have you found with your interviews that you've done that there is an intersectionality between Black women and white women and the carers, the people who take on the caring roles in society?
Yeah, definitely. I think, you know, it's so interesting because when I was researching and writing the book, a lot of the prejudice which I'm trying to bust through is that this is just a concern for city privileged white women. This is only something that, you know, this is only something that really wealthy women who are, you know, kept by their husbands, this is only of concern to them. That is such a classist. I mean, first of all, that's such a classist way of refusing to see anyone who's not a hyperprivileged woman as having a full kind of emotional landscape. It's also totally erasing, as you were very kindly mentioning, the racial element to this, because, and I mean, in the US, it's much more explicit because enslavement happened in the country where people still live. You know, in the UK, of course, there was a lot of those kinds of dynamics, but it felt further away. So that if there are women of color who are, you know, nannies or whatever, the tie back to slavery, enslavement is kind of or colonialism, honestly, in the UK, obviously feels kind of much more tenuous. But effectively, because emotional labor is not really about gender, it's about power. So it's about whoever you think has less power in a dynamic is going to be expected to cater, to put their feelings to the benefit of the experiences of the feelings of the people who have more power around them. The way in which we expect certain groups of people to do more emotional labor than others is really very explicitly tied to where they are situated in the hierarchy, whether it's gender hierarchy or race hierarchy. And as a quick parenthesis, you know, if you're a Black man in a white setting, let's say, you work in, and actually this is, I've interviewed some people, they didn't make it into the book, you know, Black men in banking, let's say, you know, where all of the white men are going to be like super alpha and bravado. And actually the Black man learns very, very quickly, this is specifically an interview I did, he learns very, very quickly that he's got to temper his way of presenting himself, because otherwise he's going to be told he's threatening. He's got to constantly be doing that modulating, regulating of emotions that's expected. So that's just, so, and that's obviously emotional labor, and that's a shift that white men are definitely not having to provide in those kinds of circumstances. But back to the mammy trope, I think it's really important. Oh no, I'm terribly sorry for my big tinging phone. I think it's really important to think of the mammy trope in relation to the mother trope, and also to, let's say, essential workers during the pandemic. We are so comfortable pretending we love and we put specific people on a pedestal. And as we put them on a pedestal, we're actually really comfortable asking them to work constantly in really hazardous situations for little to nothing. And so it's actually very hollow praise. It's a complete trick that we as a society are constantly doing. And, you know, Mother's Day happens and we're all supposedly saying, oh, mothers are amazing. But, you know, what support are we providing mothers? You know, what, after the pandemic happened and we watched in the US, 2 million women leave the workplace, but also we watched women around the world be completely, I mean, broken by the amount of work that was very specifically expected of them. And we praise them, but praising mothers, just like pretending that a mammy is genuinely loved when she's actually being economically exploited, is so fake and so replete with hypocrisy, and really is a distraction to stop us from actually moving towards meaningful policies that could create change.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on something there that jogged another thing for me. When you were talking about the man who had to sort of change his way of being to be able to fit in, there's an interesting section about tone policing. Could you tell me a little bit more about what that is and who has to do it and why?
Right. So, I mean, tone policing is a form of emotional labor we're all quite familiar with. As women, we're expected to not just make other people feel good with our smiles, we're expected to make other people feel good with our tone. As soon as we go up a bit, or we actually just speak in normal male tones, we are going to be policed. In a workplace, you know, if you are seen as, if you're actually talking, again, just like the male counterparts are talking, you might be seen to be abrasive, you know, a problem, you're going to get negative feedback. And in the US especially, I don't know whether, because I haven't lived in the UK since I was at uni, so I don't know whether the degree to which the same kind of cultural norms apply, but there's this idea of upspeak in the US, you know, that's a way of kind of making yourself sound just like a bit of a teenager. And
yeah, we've got that here.
Totally, and it means you're like totally unthreatening, and basically you're performing constantly this persona of a sweet, submissive, kind person. And anything that veers, whether anything that veers in terms of like showing actual emotional strength, you get really negative feedback. There are politicians in the US, specifically I'm thinking of Elizabeth Warren in the run-up to the last presidential election. She was seen as, I can't remember that. Oh, it's going to really annoy me. There's a specific term that was used for her, strident. Her tone was strident. And if you think about what strident means, it literally means, I mean, first of all, you would never tell a white man that they're strident. You would tell probably a woman of whatever race or a non-white man because it basically means someone who actually thinks that they deserve to be in a better situation. So you're effectively punishing someone for effectively being ambitious in terms of where they want to get. It's so, I mean, the double standards galling. And of course, and I think that's how we initially connected on social media. Is what's been so interesting is when I've been doing these interviews and trying to spread the word on the book, I've been being tone policed so much. I'm getting so much feedback because I'm communicating with confidence effectively. Actually, I'm not someone whose tone goes up hugely generally in conversation, but I mean, even if I did, it shouldn't be a problem. I communicate with confidence because I've spent years on this. And also I've been, I have the receipts, I quote dozens of academic studies. So I have the confidence of knowing that this is not just opinion. This is years and years of research, including research done by a lot of other people that all in the footnotes. But that makes people uncomfortable. So then they tell me I'm angry. And that's one way of basically silencing and dismissing, which is the case for me, but the case for so many others.
Yeah, and it touches everybody's life, I think, in the workplace, at home.
Yes.
It's everybody sees, women get called bossy. I've never heard a man get called bossy. It's the double standard. And I thought, I love the quote in the book where you talk about resting dick face. That's not a thing. What resting bitch face is.
Right. Honestly, this is actually very personal to me because I was a waitress through a lot of university, and the constant feedback was obviously when I'm not speaking, I think I have like resting tragic face. I look like look like something terrible has happened, but that's just how I am. And very, very clearly I was, and actually my first job, and that was a big lesson, my first job in my first year at uni in London, I ended up getting fired because they were like, what's wrong with you? And I was expected to be on, I was always kind to the customers and to the but then when I was like doing my thing, I kind of wasn't. And that was a huge lesson. I mean, it was like those kinds of jobs, you can get another job and then you can do better the next time. So it doesn't have a huge consequence. But I really realized, oh my gosh, this is something I've got to really work on and put a huge amount of effort into, because economically I've got to figure it out, because I need these jobs, And it's not actually do the job. You've got to do the job and be like super wonderfully charming to the people, the customers, or whatever, the people you're serving. But then you've also got to be terribly on for the managers around you, so they don't think, whatever it is. But
but this, and I know you talk about this as well. There's such a double standard even with that, where people training for the same job, men and women, will get different forms of training. Because you're a woman, you actually have to speak in this sort of way.
100%. So the it's funny, that chapter, the woman who I spoke to, I interviewed, who was basically was a recreation, like a park and recreation manager in California. And I actually was supposed to talk to her about something completely different, because I was really interested in the way in which predominantly wives, because the military is, I think it's like 98% men. I really wanted to talk to wives and loved ones of men who had been in the military, and also wives and loved ones of people who are incarcerated. Because I thought, these are like kind of like very violent policies that our governments push, and they're relying on the mass emotional labor of all of predominantly like an army of female emotional laborers who are kind of containing the hurt and the violence that these men are having to deal with. So initially the interview was about that. But then she kind of went into her work and she was like, well, when I train swim instructors in the summer in California, I have to tell women, girls, I mean, this is like very young, probably very young women just out of high school. I have to train them that they can't scream kick, kick, kick the way that men scream kick, kick, kick when they're telling kids what to do. They have to basically make themselves into like, Hollywood 1950s stars and say kick, 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 and it's not authentic. And we live in a world that's obsessed with authenticity. And it's like, you bring your whole self to work, be yourself, you should just be yourself. And if we do anything that's actually authentic, that's not within this very narrow script, we get punished. We get fired, we get, reprimanded. And like this is very real consequences, actually,
Yeah. Be a cheerleader when you come to work.
Constantly, and never turn yourself off, because if you do, everyone's going to be like, what's going on?
Yeah. And it is absolutely a woman's issue. I've never seen a man get told off for in fact, they get applauded for being, oh, isn't he broody and mysterious? We don't get that.
Totally.
We get straight in your face, love.
Right. That's exactly it.
So I want to bring us sort of a little bit up to date, and this is going to date this podcast, because actually I think this podcast so far could go out in 10 years time, and unfortunately I think we'll still be having the same conversation. I hope we're not. Rose, I'm betting on you to give us the fix here, but at the minute, everything that's going on, where you are in Florida anyway, at least with Ron DeSantis and all of his sort of legislation, anti-abortion, it feels like every single thing is directed towards taking something away from women, as if somehow we've tried too hard to have a little bit of body autonomy, a little bit of independence, and now the rich, powerful white man's going to take it back. I mean, how's that affecting you? How's it affecting Americans? I don't think it'll be long before it crosses the pond. These things so often do tend to disperse across the world once America's successfully done it. How are things going, and what are your thoughts on it?
I mean, it's, on the one end, it's really upsetting, but on the other end, it just makes me want to fight more. And the truth is that so much of how people who want to take back our rights stop us from fighting is they pretend that what we're talking about isn't really an issue, until the Supreme Court suddenly last year, totally revokes our right to bodily autonomy. And I think that part of what I'm trying to do in these conversations and spreading the word, and also a lot of other people are trying to do, is try and say, we actually never went far enough. If we'd gone further in the US, for example, there's nothing in the Constitution that says that women are equal to men. So there was an effort in the 70s into the early 80s to put in an amendment saying, well, it was the Equal Rights Amendment, saying specifically women deserve equal rights under the law than men do. And there was an incredible conservative pushback led by a woman called Phyllis Schlafly, who effectively stopped that amendment from being passed. If that amendment had been passed, Roe wouldn't have been able to be overturned. So it's almost like, yes, our mothers did amazing work, but this was the beginning. And this is not to say we're going to a world, because I have to say this sadly, because some even like very like normal seeming men are like, or even women, you know, like, you just want, you know, matriarchy. No, I don't want matriarchy. I just don't want someone else to tell me what to do with my body. No, I don't want matriarchy. I literally want to be treated the same way when I do really good work, and not be met with all of these double standards that mean that I don't get promoted, that I don't get the same kind of opportunities as my male counterparts. So it's almost like Ron DeSantis to me, you know, Trump, these are all people who are just expressing, actually, I mean, they're making it worse, and I don't want to diminish the sense of urgency, because there is a sense of urgency. We have to be so vigilant. But they're also expressing something that's never stopped being, right? You know, the year after Trump got elected, we finally had that Me Too movement take hold, and we finally had a conversation that really drummed home, this is not just a problem of just a couple of women here and there. This is something we all grow up with. This is something that drastically alters all of us, the ways in which we are able to live our life. It drastically diminishes our freedoms and our options. So I guess the only way I feel like I can react is just trying to do the work, and also trying to do the work of connecting with other women like you, you know, so that we can create forms of solidarity. Because I do think that historically, the way in which we suppress female solidarity is we get pitted against each other. And actually finding, there are, you know, so I wasn't really on social media much until the book came out, because I was, you know, trying to write this book, and I was trying to do other things. And then I did get on social media, and I kind of regret, I mean, I was somewhat on it, but not really very actively. I regret waiting so long, because for all the criticism that TikTok gets here in the US, it's been so amazing just in the last couple of months, connecting with people who obviously are so pissed about what's going on, but, you know, I might not have met in any other circumstance. And so this is like, you know, I think this is the moment where we've got to, you know, very cheesily, but I think it's real, you know, come together and create coalitions. And then wherever we are, and certainly in the US, I think this is what's needed in the next few years. Like, we've got to come up with our own policies, you know, an equivalent to the ERA, but that's maybe doable today, to push back. And that is the positive about, sadly, things going more to the right in so many worrying ways. The positive is it wakes a lot of people up who maybe, you know, would like, it's just more practical to believe that this is just how things are and it's fine. But actually, when you let things be the way that they are, they actually they either only get worse, or they just reveal themselves to be just as bad as like the worst case scenario. You know, there's all sorts of Republicans right now who are starting to put on their agendas, they want to get rid of no-fault divorce. They want women to get stuck in their marriages. They don't, 2/3 of people who file for divorce and a woman. A lot of I think it's a third, it's either a quarter or a third of them file for divorce because of domestic violence. Yeah. So when you're coming for no-fault divorce, you're not actually being pro-family. You're really telling women you want them to be stuck in bad situations. And of course, I'm someone who's about to get married. I think there are good marriages and good relationships, but we can't trick women into being stuck in bad ones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it feels like we're just going back decades, and we really are. I mean, I've said that, I think I say this every single time I do a show, but I feel like we are just around the corner from making the world Gilead. You know, The Handmaid's Tale is going to happen if this continues. Right. And I suppose that I'm very much like you. I think bringing women together, because women are the best organizers and the best at just getting shit done. Mm-hmm. We have been pitted against each other, and that's why we haven't been able to bring, you know, the group together, as it were. But I think things like your book, for example, because, like I said earlier, it highlights so many issues to me that I knew were there but didn't know were maybe being experienced by the wider population. But it feels like the more of these conversations we have, the more we read books like this and get educated on it, we realize, do you know what, we're not alone, we're all experiencing this. And then it gives us somewhere to pour our direction, which is into each other, and trying to support each other and lift each other up, to be able to challenge legislation like this, to give power to the people who have the ability to do those changes. Because as one person, we're not going to do a lot, but together yeah, it might be a bit cheesy, a bit cringy, but we achieve so much more when we work together.
Totally. And I think that point about validation, is so important, that it's not just my experience, it's your experience too. And guess what? It turns out it's also the experience of this person who lives in a totally different place in the world, but that's enduring the same culture. I think in the book, but just generally, I use the term of like, I feel like we're being systemically gaslit. Being told, we're all going through this, and then when we talk up about it, we're told it's either our individual problem or actually tied to our own behavior. Like that whole thing of me being told I'm angry, that's just someone who can't deal with taking me seriously or any of the ideas. It's actually not my ideas. It's like hundreds of women and people who I interviewed in the book and whose research I read, that's their ideas I just put together. You're telling me that you refuse to take that as real or as serious, so it's easier for you to just dismiss me as an angry person. No, this is the thing. I refuse. I'm definitely someone, as a woman, who a lot of the time in earlier years, I was taught to doubt myself. Did he really say that? I remember honestly being in Italy on a train and being like physically groped. And even because of the cultural conditioning, even then I was like, is in my head? Did I, what I mean? Did I really, what? And now I'm just like, I have so much mostly contained righteous rage. Like, no.
Yeah.
And your daughter, let's try and, like, I don't want her to go to Italy backpacking and to be freaking groped on the train, and then doubt whether or not she was groped. Like, no, there is an urgency here. Stuff needs to change.
100%. Yes. Standing ovation for that, please. And do you know what I find as well is that it's not just on well, whichever way you want to put it, it's not just a grand scale. It's not just, you can't challenge it because men feel like you're criticizing them individually as people. And so we've got legislators who won't listen and won't take what you're saying seriously, mainly because it criticizes the whole state that they've presented us, but also even in households, husbands and brothers, and they don't want to accept that there's a problem, because then we get, well, not all men, yeah, okay, fair enough, but all women, I guarantee, all women. So how do we have those conversations when they're just unwilling to accept any responsibility, or that when we say something, it's not that we're completely just criticizing them as an entire individual, but perhaps some of their behaviors?
Right. I mean, give them the book. No, I mean, yes, but I think, empathetic conversations where both people have empathy, going back to the bell hooks point, men are also losers in this system. There is really very little to be gained here for them, except for abstract sense of weaponizing competence, whereby pretending they're not able to do something, they don't actually have to do it. Because as I point out in the book, all of the studies show that men are just as able to be empathetic as women are, given the right motivation. And right now, because of gender roles that are very fixed, we're not creating really many incentives for them. But more to the point, all men, all boys are relational. They all need to feel love and to express love from a very young age, to be able to develop, and it's actually very heartbreaking the way in which we have basically told boys and men, you get to dominate, you get to kick the girl and the playground. As long as you don't cry, as long as you don't, as long as you act in all of these ways that are hyper masculine and supposedly non-emotional. But again, if you look at psychology and neuroscience, there is no such thing as a non-emotional person. We're all perceiving the world through our five senses. All of the way in which we see the world is through affect and emotions. So I feel like the best case, the best kind of conversation I feel like we can have is to say it's in your interest too. You will live a longer life if you are able to identify your emotions and communicate them with me. You will live a longer life if you are able to identify my emotions and try and help me through mine. It's not just, that there's this idea that actually a woman who's in the conclusion, so you haven't come across her yet, she's a Ghanaian British journalist who founded Esther Armour Institute for Emotional Justice. And she talks about emotional networks. And actually a few people I interviewed talk about the idea of being in an emotional network. And I think within emotional labor, it's not just a kind of a tit for tat situation. It's about taking responsibility for your position in the emotional network, which in part involves understanding your own emotions, but also your part in the emotional network makes you beholden to the emotions of other people too. And that is actually what us women are already doing. It's just, we can't be doing it alone, because alone, it means we're kind of infinitely working for everyone else. It needs to be, a self-fulfilling, a virtuous cycle. That's how. And honestly, from a policy level, just going back to the talk about the pandemic and how women were just completely, slammed by the amount of loads they had to carry emotionally, economically, the whole thing. We've got to have policies that actually reflect this essential work. And I feel like at the beginning you were asking me, what are the solutions? And I do provide some. It's almost like this is the systemic diagnosis. I also didn't want to overly just be prescriptive that we could all just as individuals. Of course, if all of us as individuals change, that's how change happens. But there needs to be a cultural shift in terms of not just seeing this form of work as work, but also valuing this form of work. And really, we can't have meaningful change without kind of a cultural movement that insists on this happening. But I do think that the next book, and I would love for it to actually be a collaborative piece of work, would be much more solutions oriented. Would be, okay, where do we go from here? What does this mean? There's some great resources. I know Eve Rodsky, who very kindly endorsed my book, who wrote Fair Play. She has a whole, I think there's a game that she developed about how to, in a fair way, share the load and talk about, domestic home issues. But I think that's not the only way in which we need to also rethink work. We also need to think work life, work private life balance. I think honestly, there's a lot of conversations here, and I'm probably going to annoy a lot of people, but I think we have to have another conversation about guaranteed income, because AI now shows us that automation was not just coming for physical labor, it's now coming for intellectual labor and creative labor.
Yeah.
To be honest, what's kind of exciting is it's not coming for emotional labor, because fundamentally emotional labor cannot be replaced. So it's almost like emotional labor, which was the most disparaged, ends up being the most resilient.
Yeah.
But emotional labor, a lot of it is happening at home. It's happening in private settings. So it's like, how, if we agree that society, governments, economies benefit from the private emotional labor, predominantly of women, how can we actually recognize that formally? And I think it needs to be recognized. I think that's part of what we need to be looking towards advocating.
Yeah. I mean, that's a huge conversation to have, isn't it? And I think you've definitely done the groundwork with this book. I think this book does the whole, these are the issues, this is what we're all experiencing, we're all doing it, and this is where we need to go. So that's an exclusive. Rose is doing another book. Yes. I'm so excited. I will be finishing this one this afternoon. I have thoroughly enjoyed it. It is so good, so well researched, so well written. You do a fantastic job on the audiobook version of it as well. So well done on that. It's not easy. And I honestly, Rose, I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours, and I'm sorry that I've rushed you through everything. There was just so much I wanted to pick up on. But please, 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 anyone who's listening or watching this, please do go and buy Emotional Labour by Rose Hackman. It will be worth it, I promise. There is so much of interest in there. And then feedback to me and Rose, tell us what you think. Tell us, do you want Rose back on the show, and we can apply our full of questions again. So Rose, thank you so much for coming on today. I've really enjoyed speaking with you and meeting you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much, Laura. It's been my pleasure. I'm so grateful for this conversation.
Thank you so much. And we'll definitely get you back on the show, I'm sure. So that's it. Find us on YouTube on Laura Lee-Fem93. The podcast will be available on all of the good podcast outlets. And we will see you again soon.